2 weeks ago, we began a two-part lesson on senior saints. And at that time, we emphasized Proverbs chapter 16, verse 31, the silver-haired head is a crown of glory if it is found in the way of righteousness. It's been said that there's 3 stages of life: youth, adulthood, and my you're looking well. And this is the second part of the my you're looking well. But I'd have to say as well, for those who are youth, watch out, blink your eyes, you are in adulthood. And for those who are in the adulthood stage, once again, kind of watch out, blink your eyes, and you are looking well. Now there are some advantages to looking well. I already qualify for a senior drink at Wendy's. And in about 8 months, I will qualify for reduced priced lunches on Sundays and Wednesdays at Captain D's. And in 4 years, I will qualify for Medicare if I don't eat too many of those Captain D's meals. But it is the case that today looking well, next week we're going to look at adulthood, and the following week a lesson on youth. In looking at that first lesson on senior saints, we looked at what is righteousness. And we saw some who began well, that is when they were young. They were good. And then they made some mistakes, sometimes grave mistakes, later in life. And so it's the case that as we are older, we can't just sit back and say, I've been good, I'll be good. No, it doesn't work that way. It's not as easy as that. The reality is, we must continue to strive to live righteously. And there are some sins that, yes, affect people at all ages, and some may be more prone even at an older age. Maybe selfish stinginess, maybe the giving up, maybe bitterness, perhaps doubt, perhaps it's unbecoming speech, or maybe despising youth. But today now we're going to look at number 2, senior saints. Now the first thing we're going to look at is seniors' decline. Now I know of those of us who are getting older, we might say, I know that, you don't need to say it. But the Bible does speak of it. In fact, it speaks extensively of it in Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verses 1 through 7. Now, in this passage, figurative language is used, and so while at times it would seem very certain what Solomon is saying, other times we might say, I'm not quite sure. He begins with, though, remember also your Creator in the days of your youth. We might look at that and see, okay, all of this is about being young. But then he says, before the evil days come. And here basically he's contrasting youth with being older. And in the being older, I think it suggests is being the much older. And so we're going to see things related to being older. He says about these evil days, before the evil days come, and the years draw near of which you will say, I have no pleasure in them. No pleasure? You see, infirmities, they press down on both the body and the mind. And what was enjoyed when we were younger is no joy any longer. No pleasures. We see verse 2 says, before the sun and the light and the moon and the stars are darkened, and the clouds return after the rain. Now I know we might kind of look at that and say, what's Solomon speaking of here? Most commentators agree that the words, before the sun and the light and the moon and the stars are darkened, and the clouds return after the earth, refer to the fading of mental powers of an individual as he grows older. And, you know, sometimes we will speak of how, I can't remember. It just seems like my memory's not as sharp as it used to be. And there's even, my dad took one. We called it the memory pill. pills that help with memory. And so maybe you've even sought out supplements, those that can help sharpen the mind. But it is a reality. Going to verse 3 says, in the days when the keepers of the house tremble. I'd suggest the keepers of the house are the arms, the hands. This is what takes care of the body and how we need our arms and our hands working. And then he says, and the strong men are bent. The strong men are bent. The legs begin to shake and tremble. Not strong like they used to be. Don't carry us around as they once did. And then he says, and the grinders cease because they are few. Grinders? I think if I didn't tell you, you'd know what this was. The teeth. The teeth. And you know, that little boy, that little girl, they lose their first tooth, and it's an exciting time, maybe frightening for that little boy and little girl. And parents will probably remember how that child lost that first tooth, but they know they're going to get a new one, the permanent tooth. Well, it's permanent until you get older and it comes out. The teeth come to the point they are few. Then we find that those who look through the windows are dimmed. Windows, the failing eyesight. And so it is. I know when I was a youth, there were no glasses. Started at a fairly early age, about age 22, I went to get driver's license and I failed the eye test. So then I started wearing glasses. And then I found out that as I was getting older and as the lens themselves, the effect they have, went to bifocals. And many of you understand that. Those who look through the windows are dimmed. And of course, those who then get to an age they suffer with cataracts. Then it's almost like blindness is coming. Oh, we can be thankful for what healthcare has done with regards to eyes. Well, then we get to verse 4. And the doors on the street are shut. The suggestion here, these doors on the street are shut, maybe the lips are closed. And connected with this, when the sound of the grinding is low. The grinders are few, kind of falling out, no teeth. Eating is quieter. And then one rises at the sound of a bird. I'd suggest here what he's speaking of is does not sleep well, waken very easily. I was reading about this, and one fellow said, everybody talks about this as you wake up easily, you know, just if the sound of a bird. He says, I tell you what, when I don't have my hearing aid in, I don't wake up at the sound of a bird. Well, maybe that's true, but yet I think all of us would recognize that sometimes the older one gets, sometimes not sleeping well becomes an issue as well. Then in verse 5 he says, and they are afraid also of what is high. Afraid of what is high? Being so feeble, they're afraid to trust themselves to ascend steps, stairs, etc. And terrors are in the way. Then there's apprehensions, fears, terrors, weakness. And sometimes it's a matter of literally negotiating a room. And the almond tree blossoms. The hair turns white. And then as you continue, the grasshopper drags itself along. Now, if you are looking at various translations, you'll see there's a little bit of difference here. For instance, New King James says the grasshopper, it becomes a burden. And so maybe the thought is that the lightest load is a burden to the aged. You know, and we say to the aged, usually it's because of the infirmities that come. I remember years ago, there was a lady Eastern Meadows. And it wasn't that she was so old, but she had some of the infirmities of the old because of MS that had come on her, multiple sclerosis. And sometimes people would go and do a little shopping for her because she wasn't able to get to the store. And she says, now don't buy me a gallon of milk, just buy me a quart. And then she explained, she said, I can't pick up a gallon, but I can pick up a quart. And we understand this. Physical strength begins to ebb the older we get. Somebody might be the exception when they say, yeah, but I didn't work out when I was young. I work out now. I'm stronger now than I was then. The rare exception. Then he says, and desire fails. It's like saying all desire diminishes. One of the basic, very basic desires of man, eating. And so much of life revolves around eating. In fact, we like it so much, say most of us then deal with a kind of an expanding waistline. You ever heard of TBS? TBS, that health condition? It'll kind of cause sometimes shortness of breath. Sometimes it'll cause kind of bloated feeling. And various things. TBS, tight belt syndrome. Eating, a basic desire. But let me tell you something. My dad, in his latter years, he didn't care if he ate or not. Now, breakfast, he loved his breakfast. You give him grits and eggs and a biscuit, and he was happy. But he didn't care if he ate the rest of the day. And then he made this statement. He says, I don't eat because I want to. I eat because I know I'm supposed to. And that just illustrates what Solomon was saying, that all desire diminishes. Desire fails. And then it gets even more specific. Man is going to his eternal home, and the mourners go about in the streets. This is referring to that death is coming to us all. Now, I'll admit, this passage is not the most encouraging. And talking about senior saints, they might say, you could have gone without saying this. I've experienced this. Don't remind me. But you know what? I appreciate that God put it in His Word. Let us know. Here's what's coming. See, for those of you in your youth, you might think, that's so far away. Once again, blink your eyes. And a decade has passed. Go to sleep one night, and 5 decades have passed. If you're young, in your youth, if you're an adult, but a young adult, God in His wisdom says, listen, here's what's going to happen. And I think then with the wise, prepare, plan, and realize it's coming. Then in verse 6, he says, before the silver cord is snapped, or the golden bowl is broken, or the pitcher is shattered at the fountain, or the wheel broken at the cistern. Now I know that seriously, as apart from some of the other phrases in the passage that seem to be easy to understand, we might look at that and say, what's he talking about? Silver cord, golden bowl, pitcher, wheel broken. Many people tend to think that this is referring to diseases of the nervous system, like the silver cord, maybe the spinal cord, or the heart disease, like the wheel broken at the cistern. And I just say this, that kind of makes sense to me. And if you were to talk about frailties of age, certainly those dealing with the diseases of the nervous system, or the circulatory system, especially the heart, they do plague us, don't they? And then in verse 7, he kind of sums it all up. And he says, and the dust returns to the earth as it was. And the spirit returns to God who gave it. And yes, he's talking about here, finally, death. And we don't have to be really reminded of this, do we? Although the New Testament speaks of it's appointed to man once to die. But we've experienced it. No, we might not ourselves have yet experienced death. But we've seen it again and again and again. Even when we were young. It was maybe our great-grandparent that was the first maybe significant within the family. For some, maybe they lost their grandparents at an early age. One grandparent died before I was born, but my grandmother on my dad's side, literally a few months after I was born, she died. Maybe she saw me. I certainly don't remember seeing her. But I made it to be an adult before my last grandparent died. And sadly, sometimes some lose a parent when they're very young. And sometimes some, very sadly, once again, lose a sibling when they're very young. But we see it. Death. And yes, it's going to come. And if we've been fortunate enough to live through Ecclesiastes 12, 1 through 6, we still get to 7. Because death can follow that old age. So we see that there is a senior decline. Let me just say this. Wait a minute. We're still living, and well, what are we to do while we live, even though aging? Now the Bible speaks literally, has a passage directly speaking to this. So we're calling this seniors' directives. There's senior decline, yes, but there's senior directives. We find that Paul writes to Titus. He says, but as for you, teach what accords with sound doctrine. Older men are to be sober-minded, dignified, self-controlled, sound in faith, in love, and in steadfastness. Older women, likewise, are to be reverent in behavior, not slanderers or slaves to much wine, that they are to teach what is good, and to train the young women to love their husbands and children, and to be self-controlled, pure, working at home, kind and submissive to their own husbands, that the word of God may not be reviled. Now let's look at this more specifically. He says, and as for you, teach what accords sound doctrine. Sound doctrine. Sound doctrine is not just what you believe and practice on Sunday. It's also how you live. And he's writing that aged men, aged women. He says, you live sound doctrine. What is this sound doctrine there to live? To the older men, they're to be sober-minded. Sober-minded. Now the American Standard Version, the New American Standard Version has the word temperate. And there's also reference even to maybe the meaning of this being vigilant. And Coffin says a life undistorted by the excessive indulgences of any kind is the thing required. Then we find he says dignified. You know, these two gentlemen here would say, they look dignified. They've got their three-piece suit on, coat and tie. Here's a man dignified even though he's in overalls, but you know what, don't you? Dignified doesn't have to do necessarily with dress, but he's speaking of, isn't he? Dignified in disposition, in demeanor. And so that's what he's saying of these aged men. Sober-minded or temperate. Be dignified. Then he says be self-controlled. Now here's an interesting thing. Because you see, similar to sober-minded, you saw that some translations would have temperate instead of sober-minded. And now here you have self-control, which is basically temperate. This word, different Greek words, but yet similar enough in meaning that some translations have temperate as the first characteristic. Other translations have temperate as the third characteristic. So I guess we could take a step back and realize there is a vast importance on having a clear mind and then being careful to do. what we should be doing. Self-controlled. Then he says older men are to be sound in faith. Kaufman says older men should cling to the fundamental doctrines of Christianity. We find that Zur says of this, sound in faith means to be true to the Word of God, which is the basis of faith. You know, if I didn't have these quotes, I think you could understand what it means to be sound in faith. And I know we might take a step back and say, wait. This person is aged. They've had this lifetime of study. They've gotten to this point where surely, do they have to really be told to be sound in faith? You know, when I was much younger, I didn't have the observation, the experience of life that I have now. And at this juncture in life, I'd say, I'm glad this is there. I'm glad he says specifically to older or aged men to be sound in faith. Why, Steve? Why do you see that as a needed thing for Paul to say? I have seen the times that men and women, they had been faithful, they had been sound, they had studied. The Scriptures were their guide until their children or their grandchildren began to compromise in their beliefs and compromise in their teachings and compromise in their practice. And the things they began to go and to do that their parents or grandparents formerly had maybe taught against. But seeing the people that mean the most, the children, the grandchildren, doing these things, I think, well, maybe I need to rethink. Maybe I need to restudy. There's never anything ever wrong with studying. But if I, in the back of my mind, have the purpose of, I want to figure out how I don't like what they're doing. But I'd like to figure out that it's okay. And so the compromises happen. You know, and as I say this, many of you would have to say as well, I've seen that happen. I've seen it happen. The love that you have for your children cannot be described, cannot even be really even understood unless it's by those who have children. And the love you have for your grandchildren, once again, can't be really described, and it can only be understood by those who have those grandchildren. But no matter what choices they make in life, I need to continue to be sound in faith. Then he also says to be sound in love. An old man should evince love for all, especially for those who are good. He should overcome at this time in his life all the fiery, impetuous, envious, wrathful passions of his early years, and his mind should be subdued into sweet benevolence. A good way to describe it. Sound in patience. And so in the infirmities of the old age, in the trials resulting from the loss of friends and of their early years, in their loneliness in the world, they should show that the effect of all of God's dealings with them has been to produce patience. Sound in faith, love, and patience. Putting all this together, it's with faith that we worship God. No prayer, no work of piety can be severed from faith. Love spreads its wings over all our duties to our neighbors, and patience must ever go hand in hand with faith and love. But then he says directly to women, older women likewise are to be reverent in behavior, not slanderers or slaves to much wine. They're to teach what is good, and so train the young women. First of all, reverent in behavior. Behavior is becometh holiness, is the King James Version. And we might say, is she a reverent lady or a reveling lady? Reverent in behavior. Next, not slanderers. Is it truthful? Ask yourself that. Does it need to be said? Ask yourself that. You see, much harm has come from the misuse of the tongue. And then he says, not slaves to much wine. You'll never be a slave to wine if you never take the first drink. Teach what is good. Pass it on. You must be the woman, though, of verse 3, to be the teacher of verse 3. You're to train the young women. In a specific way, train the young women to love their husbands and children, to be self-controlled, pure, working at home, kind, submissive to their own husbands. The Word of God may not be reviled. And so here you have it in Titus chapter 2. Senior directives. There's the senior decline. Solomon's clear on that. Senior directives. Paul in Titus 2's clear on that. And so we might then say, well, what can I do? I've reached a point that in a kind way people call me a senior. Or they may say to me, "My, you're looking well." There's still something I can do. What can I do? Don't be like the rich man. Look in Luke 12:16. And he told a parable saying, the land of a rich man produced plentifully. Now understand this. He's just talking about a rich man here. He doesn't say that he's young or old. But look at a principle. He thought to himself, what shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops. He said, I'll do this. I'll tear down my barns and build larger ones. And there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry. Now the rich man was saying this, but I'd suggest to you a lot of times people get older in life, they reach a point, they retire from their work, and they have this attitude sometimes. So, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry. God said, fool, this night your soul will be required of you, and the things that you have prepared, whose will they be? So don't have this attitude. This next part of this lesson is senior deeds. Some things that seniors can do. And I'll just say this. I'm thankful that through my life I've had some great examples of some who are older and some things that they would do. Some of these things are on this list. Maybe walk your neighborhood, literally knocking on neighbors' doors to see if they're interested in knowing more about the Bible. I've known of some to do this, and they became great soul winners as they were older. Help with a nursing home or assisted living devotional. William Deal's daddy, Roger Deal, he would go to the nursing home, Crown. Soon after he moved to Montgomery, he went once a month. But then he came to the point he was basically over it. He was there every week. He was a song leader for everybody. And if somebody wasn't there, he would sing and he would speak as well. He passed away. Now, Jesse Russell's there every week. He's a song leader for everybody. Well, you have more time. Make the use of it. Teach a Sunday or Wednesday class. You have more time to prepare now. Help with World Bible School. And of course, you know that Brother George Davidson, retired, puts in lots and lots of hours. And a few are helping him. But a great thing to do as we're older, take a mission trip. Mission trip? I have these two friends, and Facebook's a wonderful thing. I went to school at Alabama Christian College with him, and I literally didn't connect back with him till about 2 or 3 years ago. And he was fortunate enough that he was able to retire a little sooner than some. I'm not sure if he hit 62 and retired, but he goes to Ukraine. He's been there 3 different years at least, maybe 4. And he does the kind of the let's start talking, where he puts ads in newspapers, etc. And he has Bible studies on the basis of teaching English. And he and his wife go there, spend about 2 months when they go, and do this work. Nobody told them to do it. They're not a part of a bigger group. They meet there with the local church, encouraging the ministers there in the local church to meet these people so they can have influence on them and be contacts. Take a mission trip. Help with quilts like the Dorcas Deeds ladies. Most of the Dorcas Deeds ladies would be retired, and they've made literally hundreds of these quilts and brightened the faces of many people. Yeah, wash church building windows. When I moved to Eastern Meadows, actually the first service I was ever present, it was kind of my tryout sermon on Sunday night. Brother J.T. Norton led the prayer that evening. And I really can't tell you much else about that service, but I was so very impressed with this man and his prayer. He didn't pray that prayer to impress anybody, but I was impressed with that man. Then when I moved to Montgomery and began to preach at Eastern Meadows, there I'd be in the building, and there were not many days that he wouldn't stick his head and say, "Hey, up here," and he might say what he's doing. But it was everything from repairing something on the inside to planting something or watering something on the outside. And he lived nearby. And the day he passed away, you know, the last thing he had been doing? Been up at the church building doing some work. Went home, got home, had a heart attack in his driveway, and died. But he was there doing what he could do. And you know, there's always something that needs to be doing. Even if it's as simple as washing windows, or I said this, washing dauber's nest around the outside of a church building. There's always something that could be done. Visiting the hospital, sending encouraging cards and making encouraging phone calls. Mentoring. In other words, like the older women teaching the younger women. Attend Bible study opportunities that you did not have time to attend when you were working, such as maybe Thursday class or Monday night motivation. Attend Bible lectureships. There's many good ones. Go. Now, all of these are just kind of a sampling of things that maybe, in other words, you have time, more time to do than you did when you were working, and use that time for good and for God. Senior deeds. But then there's also, last of all, senior decisions. And there's some tough decisions ahead. For instance, retirement. When can I? And can I? Have a preaching friend that he retired a few years ago, and he had another preaching friend says, "I want to talk to you about this retirement thing." He said, "Come over." And he says, we talked, and he says, I turned to him and said, "You can't retire." You know, maybe it comes to that, but we have decisions. Is there money in retirement? What about the health care? Do we have a living will? What about a will? Literally, I knew a man, he signed his will the day before he passed away. You're talking about waiting to the 9th hour. And then there's that final arrangements. Now, no, none of this we like to think about, but it's the reality, and it's facing what's coming with final arrangements. Do we have prearranged funerals or not? I want to say this, my dad did, and it was like, I felt like when we sat down that he had given us one of his last gifts, because it was so easy, because he had already done it. Now, we've not done that ourselves, I'll admit. We have 2 places to be put over at Alabama Heritage. I got a deal on those lots. But that's about all we've got at this point. But one day we need to do that. but decisions to be made. Senior saints. Today we looked at seniors' decline, seniors' deeds, seniors' decisions. And next week we're going to be looking at adulthood. The most important thing, me and God. It's you and God. Death's not limited to those who are old. We've all known the young, yes, they can die too. This is a song that the third verse is very much, and this is the verse that Paul's going to be singing for the invitation. And I want you to see these words. God in His mercy and His love speaks to your heart today through the blessed words from heaven above. Why not obey His word? And so God's speaking to you through His word. Will you obey? Bring Him your life, your strength, your all. Give Him yourself complete. Trust Him for lifting you when you fall. Safely your soul He'll keep. I don't know that the gentleman who wrote this meant it as an invitation song. This third verse, it well fits. And it is a song like Will You Come? And so if we could assist you in your obedience, there's a need to be baptized for the forgiveness of sins. If you're that penitent believer, we can give you opportunity to confess your faith and assist you in baptism. If there's a need for prayer, I'd be glad to take the time and pray for you. If you need to come, please come as